Hey there, Christopher here, and today we're looking at what happens when people step into environments where the danger is already there, just out of sight. From a muddy riverbank in northern Australia, where a saltwater crocodile struck from beneath the surface, to the frozen edge of Antarctica, where a leopard seal surged up from dark water without warning. These are not just stories about happy vacations. They are stories that haunted once happy memories. It was March 18, 2017, in a remote coastal region of northern Australia, where mangrove-lined riverbanks stretched along slow-moving tidal channels that pushed inland from the sea. The terrain was dense and low, the ground shifting between firm and soft without warning, and the line between land and water was never entirely clear. The water itself was the color of dark tea, stained by tannins from the surrounding vegetation, and the incoming tide was pushing it further up the bank, narrowing the dry ground and reducing visibility near the shoreline to near zero. Brandon Cole, 27, was a fitness content creator from California. He was physically confident, accustomed to outdoor environments, and had joined a small locally guided wildlife excursion through the region as part of a broader travel itinerary. He had no formal background in wildlife or field safety, but he was the kind of person who moved through unfamiliar environments with ease, rarely treating new situations as something that required adjustment. The tour itself was minimal in structure. One guide, a small group of travelers, and marked but unfenced terrain along tidal waterways. No barriers, no elevated platforms, and no physical separation between the group and the environment they were moving through. It was the kind of setup that works perfectly well when everyone follows the rules, and becomes something else entirely when someone doesn't. The first portion of the excursion passed without issue. The group moved along the riverbank at a measured pace, observing tracks pressed into the mud and environmental markers the guide pointed out along the way. The guide had established one consistent rule from the start: maintain at least 20 to 25 feet from the water's edge at all times. He had explained the reasoning clearly. The murky water made it impossible to see what was beneath the surface, and the incoming tide was pushing the effective range of the bank closer to the group with every passing minute. The rule was not a suggestion. It was the only reliable margin of safety available in that environment. And in my experience researching these cases, guides who work tidal crocodile habitat don't repeat that instruction casually. They repeat it because they've seen what happens when it isn't followed. At approximately 11:20 a.m., the group paused near a section of muddy riverbank where tracks had been spotted earlier that morning. The guide repeated the distance instruction clearly before anyone moved. What most people don't fully appreciate about saltwater crocodiles is how completely the animal is built around a single moment. I've read through enough incident reports to know that the victims almost never see it coming, not because they weren't paying attention, but because the animal is specifically designed to prevent that. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth. Adults regularly exceed 17 feet in length and can weigh over 2,000 pounds. They are capable of remaining completely motionless beneath the surface for extended periods, with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, and in murky or tidal water, even those are invisible. They do not stalk in the way a land predator stalks. They position themselves and they wait. Once triggered, the strike is committed. The lunge covers distance in a fraction of a second, and the force of the initial bite is enough to drag an adult human off their feet before any resistance is possible. The animal does not need to chase. It only needs the target to come close enough. Brandon moved closer to the bank. He closed the gap to less than 10 feet, stepping onto damp, unstable mud at the water's edge to get a clearer view of the shoreline. As he adjusted his footing, a section of the bank gave way slightly beneath him, a small collapse, no more than a few inches, but enough to send a brief and distinct vibration through the mud and into the water directly below. The noise was minimal. The movement was enough. The crocodile was already there. The attack came without any preceding surface disturbance, an upward lunge that closed the remaining distance before Brandon could recover his balance. The terrain offered no stable footing to push back from, and the proximity left the guide with no effective window to intervene. From everything I've studied about crocodile attacks in tidal environments, this is exactly the scenario that guides in northern Australia describe as the most difficult to prevent. The water looks empty, the bank looks stable, and by the time anything changes, the window to act is already gone. Brandon's remains were recovered with the assistance of local wildlife authorities over the following day. The guide was cleared of negligence, having issued repeated and explicit distance warnings throughout the excursion. The tour operation was reviewed internally, with stricter boundary enforcement implemented at all water stops going forward, physical markers placed at the required distance from the bank, and a policy requiring the group to remain stationary and together during any pause near the water. There was no extended media coverage, and the incident was documented in regional wildlife safety records and referenced in subsequent guide training in the area. Saltwater crocodile attacks in northern Australia follow a consistent pattern in the documented record. The victim is almost always within 10 feet of the water's edge. The water is almost always murky or tidal, and there is almost always a guide instruction that was not followed. Brandon's case fits that pattern precisely, which is part of what makes it so difficult to set aside. The outcome was not unpredictable. It was the direct result of a single decision to close a distance that had been established specifically to prevent it. Even in environments where the danger is clearly communicated, the threat itself remains invisible until the moment it acts. The next case is different in setting, colder, more remote, and involving an animal that most people would not immediately associate with lethal predatory behavior. But the underlying dynamic is the same: a predator operating from below the surface in water that gave no indication of what it contained. It was November 6th, 2014, along a remote Antarctic shoreline where low ice shelves met dark, near freezing water under a pale and cloudless sky. The landscape was open and stripped of anything that could be described as cover, flat ice, gray water, and a horizon that offered no reference point for scale or distance. The conditions that afternoon were as stable as they ever get that far south. Clear visibility, minimal wind, and a flat surface on the water that reflected the sky almost perfectly. Claire Dubois, 35, was a documentary editor from France. She had spent years working with footage from remote environments, editing sequences that other people had filmed in places exactly like this one. And the trip to Antarctica was something she had planned for a long time. She joined a small private expedition to the region as a personal trip, traveling with a group of roughly 8 people under the supervision of 2 experienced polar guides. Landings on ice-covered terrain were short, timed, and conducted with clear protocols about where the group could move and how close they could get to the water's edge. The guides were not casual about the rules. They had worked in polar environments long, enough to understand that the conditions that look the safest are often the ones that carry the most risk. Claire had followed the group's protocols without issue throughout the earlier portion of the expedition. She was methodical by nature and had not given the guides any reason for concern during the previous landings. The stop on November 6th was treated as routine, a short landing on a stable section of ice shelf with the group spread out but within sight of one another, and both guides positioned to monitor movement near the water. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Claire was positioned along the low edge of the ice shelf, within a few feet of the waterline. The ice at that section was flat and solid, and the water below was dark and completely still. She crouched low to stabilize herself and extended one hand briefly into the water. Leopard seals are not an animal that most people think of as dangerous, and I think that gap between perception and reality is exactly what makes encounters with them so hard to prepare for. People picture seals as docile, almost clumsy animals, and for most species, that's not entirely wrong. Leopard seals are a different category entirely. Adults reach up to 11 feet in length and can weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their build is elongated and muscular, with a disproportionately large head and jaws designed for gripping and tearing, rather than the fish-catching mechanics of most other seal species. They are apex hunters in their environment, and their primary prey, penguins, are caught through ambush from below. The seal positions itself beneath the surface, near areas where penguins enter or exit the water, and strikes upward with explosive speed when movement is detected above. They do not circle or signal. They do not investigate cautiously. They approach from depth, and the first indication of their presence is the strike itself. When contact is made, they pull downward, using their body weight and the resistance of the water to maintain control of whatever they have caught. That last detail is the one that I think people least expect. It is not a single strike and release. The animal is built to hold on and pull down. The attack came from beneath the water, without any visible warning. The surface had shown nothing. No ripple, no shadow, no movement of any kind. The seal surged upward from below, made contact with Claire's arm and upper body, and pulled her from the ice shelf and into the water before either guide could close the distance. The water temperature in that region sits near 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The guides reached the edge within seconds and worked to pull her back onto the ice, but the time she spent submerged, combined with the trauma from the initial strike and the effect of the water temperature on her body, had already determined the outcome. She did not survive. I've come across a small number of documented leopard seal incidents involving researchers and divers near the ice edge, and what stands out in almost every case is how little warning preceded the contact. There is a prior fatal case in the research record involving a marine biologist pulled underwater in similar circumstances off the Antarctic Peninsula. The behavior is rare, but it is not without precedent, and the animal in Claire's case was not acting outside its natural patterns. It detected movement at the surface and responded to it the same way it would respond to a penguin entering the water. The fact that the target was a person made no difference to the animal. That is something I find genuinely difficult to sit with. The complete absence of intent on the animal's part and the complete finality of the outcome, regardless. The expedition operator revised its internal landing procedures following the incident. Future landings required all group members to remain a minimum of 6 feet from the ice edge during any shoreline stop, regardless of conditions or visibility. What makes this case particularly difficult is that nothing about the environment looked dangerous. The water was calm, the weather was clear, and the group was supervised. The threat existed entirely below the surface, invisible and already in position before anyone on the ice shelf had any reason to look for it. A single brief movement at the water's edge was enough to trigger a response that the environment made impossible to survive. Not every dangerous encounter in the wild is hidden beneath the surface. In the next case, the animal was fully visible from the moment the vehicle stopped. The guide had already identified the risk and communicated it clearly. The outcome still came down to one decision, made in plain sight, in broad daylight, with nothing obscuring the threat at all. It was July 9th, 2018, in a remote section of the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where open grassland stretched wide between patches of dense brush and the morning air was still cool from the night before. The light was flat and clear, and visibility across the plain extended for several hundred yards in every direction. There was nothing subtle about the landscape. It was open ground, and everything on it was visible. Victor Ramirez, 39, was a business owner from Florida. He ran a mid-sized logistics company, was accustomed to making decisions quickly, and carried the kind of practical confidence that comes from years of managing operations under pressure. He had booked a privately guided safari through the Okavango as part of a longer trip through southern Africa, his first time on the continent. The tour operated with one guide and a small group in an open vehicle. Victor had no prior safari experience, but he had done enough research to feel prepared, and that sense of preparation shaped how he engaged with the environment from the first morning. In my experience going through safari incident records, that combination, first-time visitor, high personal confidence, no formal wildlife, background, appears more often than it should in cases that end badly. The trip had gone well through the first day and a half. The group had covered significant ground, observed a range of wildlife from the vehicle, and the guide had maintained a consistent and professional approach throughout. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on July 9th, the vehicle stopped on open ground, roughly 60 yards from a solitary Cape buffalo, standing near a line of low vegetation at the edge of the plain. The guide read the situation immediately. A lone bull, separated from any herd, standing in the open and already oriented toward the vehicle. He communicated the assessment to the group clearly. No one was to stand or make sudden movements. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely hard to understand. Even after going through cases like this repeatedly, the guide had already told the group what they were looking at. The animal was visible. The risk was not abstract. It was standing 60 yards away, in open ground. And still, what happened next happened. There is a reason that Cape buffalo appear consistently at the top of documented large animal fatality records in sub-Saharan Africa. Adult bulls weigh up to 1,500 pounds and can reach speeds approaching 35 miles per hour in a charge, fast enough to cover 60 yards in under 4 seconds. Their horns fuse at the base as they age, forming a dense, hardened boss across the forehead that functions as a solid battering structure. When a Cape buffalo charges, it does not veer. It targets the source of the disturbance and drives into it with full body weight at full speed, Older bulls that have separated from the herd, referred to in the region as daga boys, are consistently more dangerous than herd animals. They are more alert, more territorial, and more likely to treat any unfamiliar presence as a direct threat rather than something to be assessed and avoided. A lone daga boy, standing in the open and watching a vehicle, is not a passive animal. It has already registered the intrusion and is deciding how to respond to it. I've read accounts from guides who describe that moment, the animal standing still, watching, as the most dangerous phase of the encounter, because it means the animal is already engaged. Victor stood up inside the open vehicle, raising his upper body above the frame and making loud, sudden movements that carried across the open ground. The guide instructed him to sit down. Victor remained standing. The bull's response was immediate. Its head dropped, its ears flattened against its skull, its tail lifted. The full sequence of pre-charge behavior compressed into less than 2 seconds, and then it moved. At 60 yards and 35 miles per hour, the time between the initiation of the charge and impact was under 4 seconds. The guide attempted to reposition the vehicle, but the distance was too short, and Victor was still fully exposed above the frame, with no time to drop back into the seat. The buffalo struck the front side of the vehicle at full speed. Victor took the primary force of the impact directly, the boss connecting with his body and driving him backward with the full weight of the animal behind it. The guide radioed for emergency assistance immediately and worked to keep the animal from returning while attending to Victor. Emergency services reached the location approximately 50 minutes later. Victor was unresponsive by the time help arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. The internal injuries sustained in the impact were not survivable in the field, and the evacuation time made any intervention impossible regardless. The guide was cleared of any negligence. He had correctly identified the animal as high risk from the moment the vehicle stopped and had no physical means of forcing compliance once Victor had made his decision. From my own research into large herbivore attacks, what strikes me most about Cape Buffalo incidents is how, consistently, the outcome is determined before the charge even begins. The animal's behavior in the seconds before it moves tells you exactly what is about to happen. The guides know it. The problem is that the people who most need to respond to that information are often the ones least inclined to take it seriously. By the time the charge begins, the decision has already been made, and not by the animal. The case was incorporated into guide training by the regional safari operator as a reference point for managing non-compliant guests in open vehicle situation. The buffalo was not pursued. It had acted entirely within the behavioral patterns of its species. An open vehicle in large herbivore territory is not a comfortable platform for observation. It is the only barrier available. The moment a person rises above it, they become the most visible and exposed element in the environment. And in a landscape where animals like Cape Buffalo operate, that exposure is not a calculated risk. It is the removal of the only protection that existed. The first 3 cases in this episode all involved animals that reacted to something they could directly detect. Movement at the water's edge, a hand breaking the surface, a figure rising above a vehicle frame. The final case carries a different quality entirely. There was no visible animal, no warning behavior, and no single moment of obvious poor judgment. There was only a set of environmental conditions that had been building quietly across several days, and a routine that had never been tested until the morning it was. It was February 23rd, 2013, off the coast of Recife, where darker Atlantic water rolled toward a shoreline shaped by sandbars and tidal channels. Rivers feeding into the coast carried sediment that often reduced visibility beneath the surface, turning the water a muted green-brown, where shapes disappeared only a few feet below. In the early morning hours, the beach was quiet, used mostly by locals who entered the water before the heat and crowds of the day arrived. Lila Fernandez, 28, was a nurse from Brazil. She was fit, disciplined, and a confident swimmer, the kind of person whose comfort in the water had been built over years rather than months. She had been staying near a quiet stretch of shoreline along the coast for several days as part of a personal trip, and she had established a routine of early morning swims along the same section of coast. She entered the water before most people were awake, moved parallel to the shore, and gradually extended her distance from land as the days passed. Nothing about the pattern had produced any concern. The water was calm each morning, and visibility near the surface was usually just clear enough for swimmers to feel comfortable. The routine itself was the problem, though it would not have been visible as such from the outside. Each morning, Lila moved a little further from shore. Each morning, the swim ended without incident, and that outcome reinforced the sense that the environment was safe and the distance was manageable. By the morning of February 23rd, the routine had extended far enough that it placed her in conditions that were categorically different from where she had started. Deeper water, a different light environment, and proximity to a section of the seafloor that changed the nature of the marine activity around her. I've spent time thinking about cases like this one, and what makes them so difficult is that there is no moment you can point to and say, that was the mistake. The routine felt safe because it had always ended safely. That kind of gradual drift into risk is something I find genuinely unsettling, because it doesn't look like a bad decision from the inside. It just looks like another morning's swim. And I think that's what makes it the most dangerous kind of situation. Not the ones where someone ignores a clear warning, but the ones where there is no warning at all, and the risk has been accumulating quietly the entire time. On the morning of February 23rd, Lila entered the water at approximately 6:50 a.m. The sun had not yet fully risen. The light across the surface was low and angled, coming in flat from the east and creating a strong contrast between the illuminated surface and the darkness below. From below, anything moving near the surface would have been silhouetted clearly against the light, a high contrast shape against a bright background, the kind of visual signal that registers strongly in the sensory environment of a large marine predator. By the time she reached deeper water, she was estimated to be over 100 feet from land, near a deeper channel between offshore sandbars, where the depth increased suddenly compared to the surrounding shallows. Small fish were active near the surface in the area, a natural feeding pattern indicating the presence of a food source in the water column below. The water around the deeper tidal channel beyond the sandbars was not empty. It was a feeding zone, and it had been one before Lila arrived that morning. That detail matters because it means the conditions that morning were not random. They were the product of an environment that was already active, already in motion, in ways that were not visible from the surface. Tiger sharks are one of the few shark species that appear consistently in fatal attack records across multiple ocean environments, and the reason for that consistency is rooted in their biology. Adults regularly exceed 14 feet in length and can weigh over 1,400 pounds. They are not specialists. They do not target a specific prey type or operate within a narrow ecological niche. They are opportunistic hunters that investigate movement, contrast, and biological signals in the water with a breadth that most other large sharks do not match. Unlike some shark species that make an initial investigative pass before committing, tiger sharks are documented to make direct, decisive contact on the first approach. The conditions that increase the probability of an encounter are well established in the research. Low light environments, deeper water near tidal channels between offshore sandbars, areas with active prey or feeding activity, and a solo swimmer moving at the surface. On the morning of February 23rd, every one of those conditions was present at the same time, in the same location. When I look at that list and then look at where Lila was swimming that morning, the overlap is exact. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The attack occurred below the surface, out of clear view from shore. No disturbance was visible from land. No surface activity, no sound. Nothing that would have indicated to anyone watching from the beach that anything had changed. Lila did not return from the water at the expected time, and concern developed only after an extended absence that went beyond what the routine would have produced. A search was initiated, focusing on the deeper section of water within the tidal channel, beyond the sandbars where she had last been seen. Her remains were recovered later that day by local maritime search teams working the deeper tidal channel beyond the offshore sandbars. The injuries were consistent with a large shark attack concentrated on the lower body. The cause of death was determined to be blood loss from the initial strike. She had been in the water for less than 30 minutes. The incident was reviewed by local maritime and wildlife authorities. No shark was identified or pursued. The stretch of shoreline near the deeper tidal channel beyond the sandbars was flagged in local advisories, with guidance issued against early morning swimming in low light conditions near known depth transitions and areas of active surface feeding. The advisories were distributed through the small network of accommodation operators along the surrounding coastline and posted at the primary beach access points. What makes this case stand apart from the others in this episode is the absence of any single identifiable error in the conventional sense. Lila was not ignoring a guide. She was not standing somewhere she had been told not to stand. She was doing something she had done before, in a place that had never given her reason for concern. The risk had been building quietly across multiple mornings, the routine extending further each day, the location drifting closer to the deeper tidal channel beyond the sandbars. And on that particular morning, the environmental conditions aligned in a way they had not before. The light angle, the depth, the fish activity, none of those factors were new individually. Together, on that morning, they produced something the routine had never actually been tested against. That is the element of this case that stays with me. The environment that Lila was swimming in on February 23rd was not the same environment she had entered on the first morning of the trip, even though it looked the same from the surface. The routine had extended into a different set of conditions without any single moment where that transition was obvious. And that, more than anything else in this episode, is what I think is worth carrying forward. The idea that familiarity with a place is not the same as understanding it, and that an environment can change around you in ways that are completely invisible until they aren't. Each of the 4 people in this episode made decisions that felt reasonable in the moment. Some ignored direct warnings from guides who understood the environment far better than they did. That sequence of ordinary decisions is what I keep coming back to in cases like these. Not the attacks themselves, but everything that came before them. Each step looked manageable. Each choice felt justified. And none of them looked like what they actually were until it was too late to change them. That pattern doesn't belong to any one environment or any one animal. It shows up across every case I've covered on this channel, and it's the reason I keep coming back to these stories. Drop your thoughts below and let me know what kind of encounters you want to see covered in the next episode.